They've been asking me each week, hey, where are you tonight, so that we can have the right numbers in the newsletter or on the screen. And I just tell them, I don't know. And I don't know how, and I don't know how far we're going to get. It's not like a Sunday morning. So here's what I'm going to do, especially for the rest of this study in Deuteronomy. We're just going to try to kind of go chapter by chapter, but I'm not going to really worry about where the chapters start and stop. And we're just going to do what we have time for on Wednesday nights, okay? I did want to point out a couple of things about Deuteronomy 18. So we'll pick up in verse 15, and then we'll jump into mostly chapter 19 tonight. And I do want to say a word about the first part of chapter 20 if we have time for that. As you're finding your place in God's Word, I did want to mention to you two just brief prayer requests. If you saw or take the Newton Citizen, there was a great article written about our building project, and we hope that that will be a positive thing for our church and for our community. That article was published today. We're grateful for that. Tomorrow you can pray as the city comes out to do a final disconnect of the gas. They're going to have to cut into the street in order to disconnect the gas. So pray for that work to be able to be done. Pray for it to be able to be done safely. And then they have told us that unless something changes, Monday is the day. Monday is the day that things will begin to come down. And so pray for the demo crew that will be here on site starting next week to begin that work. It has been a long time. And I'll say more on Sunday morning. We know that it will be an emotional time as well. So let's make it a matter of deep and fervent prayer next week. Okay? Deuteronomy chapter 18, beginning of verse 15. We read this passage last week, but just pointing out for you verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. So this is the section of Deuteronomy when Moses is talking about priests and prophets, who to listen to, who to not listen to, how the kings are supposed to be the kind of people who meditate on the law of God day and night. They don't let the law of God depart from them. And so all along we've been reading about the kind of spiritual authority that God is putting over the people as they're going to go back into the land. We got a lot of new people here tonight, so I can't backtrack and reteach it all. But Deuteronomy is essentially zooming in on the Ten Commandments. And so we've been in this section over the last few weeks where we're in the commandment of honor father and mother. And the correlation here is that God puts people in our lives that are in authority over us. And Deuteronomy for these last few chapters has been unfolding in an expositional way. Here's what that's going to look like when you go into the land. Here's how you're going to be submissive to priests. Here's what priests are supposed to do. Here's how you know how to select kings. And here's the criteria and the qualifications. And here's how you know who to listen to in terms of those who will speak on my account or on my behalf. And so right here at the end of Deuteronomy 18, where we ended last week, there's this wonderful passage about Moses giving to the people a word from the Lord that God is going to raise up a prophet like him from among the brothers. And of course, we went ahead and made that ultimate leap into the New Testament to see and to know and to clarify that that prophet like Moses is the Lord Jesus. And I want to just, if you didn't have time to write them down last week, I want to just write down a few passages for you to look up for further study. I mean, one would be Mount of Transfiguration, where the deity of Christ is revealed, but there's also conversation about these Old Testament prophetic figures and why Christ is better than them. His glory is revealed. Another would be the baptism of Jesus. And so when you look up the baptism of Jesus, think about what you hear at the baptism of Jesus when the heavens open and the Spirit descends on Jesus in the form of a dove, and there's a voice heard from heaven. Remember what the voice says? This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Later on, one of those gospel writers is going to say, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. Listen to him. we should think of that in a new covenant day. We should think of that as new covenant people. When we read a passage like Deuteronomy 18:15, the Lord your God will raise up from among you a prophet like me, and it is to him you shall listen. Just imagine that scene. Heavens open, Spirit descends, voice from the Father says, this is my beloved Son. You listen to him. Acts 3 and Acts 7. Peter and Stephen, both in their sermons, talk about Jesus being the one who's raised up like Moses. And then when we come to the book of Hebrews describes Jesus as the one who's better in every respect, right? A greater high priest, a greater sacrifice. His blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. All throughout the book of Hebrews, we're reading this. And it reminds us of Deuteronomy 34. When Moses is on the verge of getting to the promised land, but he's already been told he's not going to see it, and he's near death. It's recorded for us there and then picked up on again in Hebrews that there's been no prophet like Moses who talked with God face to face until Jesus. Because Jesus is the very face of God who explains the Father to us. So those are just a bunch of passages of Scripture that I would encourage you to go back and reread and hold them together with this prophecy from Deuteronomy chapter 18. Now, as we open Deuteronomy 19, now we shift into the corresponding section of Deuteronomy that is linked to the sixth commandment. What's the sixth commandment? You're having to go through them in your head again, right? You shall not murder. So over the next couple of chapters, we're going to have unfolding for us laws about murder, laws about manslaughter, laws about warfare, laws about cities of refuge. And so these sections of Deuteronomy are corresponding to that. Remember last week I used the language, it's like a double click. You double click on that commandment, you shall not murder. And now in the second giving of the law, Moses is unfolding from the Lord. Okay, now here's what that practically is going to look like as you enter the land. All of Deuteronomy, we have to have poised in our head and heart. All of Deuteronomy is the people being told how they're to live in the land underneath God's law. When you take the land, this is how you're going to live. Okay? Deuteronomy 19. When the Lord your God cuts off the nations whose land the Lord your God is giving you, and you dispossess them and dwell in their cities and in their houses, you shall set apart 3 cities for yourselves in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. You shall measure the distances and divide into 3 parts the area of the land that the Lord your God gives you as a possession, so that any manslayer can flee to them. This is the provision for the manslayer, who by fleeing there may save his life. If anyone kills his neighbor unintentionally without having hated him in the past. All right, so let's stop there. These are laws about cities of refuge. I think in our day, we have to clarify, we're not talking about like sanctuary cities here, okay? We're not talking about modern day immigration reform or policy that deals with sanctuary cities in the United States of America. We're dealing with the theocracy of ancient Israel, God giving his law, and for them to impose the law in the land when they take it. And we've already seen this be talked about in Exodus 21 and in Numbers 34, Numbers 35. So all of this has been unfolded, these cities of refuge. What are they? Somebody just quickly tell me what they are. Okay? It's a place that people could go for refuge, right? Yeah, that's a safe way to put it. Jerry? Okay, so 3 cities were ultimately established: Kadesh and Shechem and Hebron. These would become the 3 cities in the land of Israel. There would be 3 cities beyond the river, beyond the Jordan, that are also mentioned in the Old Testament, but these are the main 3. We just read in this passage that distance matters, that they're to measure out the distance. Why? Why is that important? That's right. You don't want to have to get a head start, but then go all the way across the land, all the way over by the Mediterranean Sea to try to seek out a city of refuge if someone's coming after you. So the Lord in his providential order says, I want you to have 3 cities of refuge, essentially equidistant within the land, so that if something happens and someone needs to get there, they can get there quickly. Now, we're using the language in our English translations, the manslayer, or your older translations may say that this is the person that commits manslaughter. And this is distinguished from murder. Verse 4 tells us that. This is the provision when someone's fleeing, when they've killed someone unintentionally. They've killed their neighbor unintentionally. So there is a differentiation between what we would call in English law premeditated first-degree murder and unintentional manslaying in the Old Testament. What the law provided for, which we've already seen in Leviticus and in Numbers, in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, is that when murder was committed, the family of the one that was killed was allowed to take retribution underneath the Mosaic law and kill the murderer of their loved one. If everything was clear, if everything was cut and dry, then it was eye for eye, and God's law allowed for there to be capital punishment or retribution. But it had to be clear. It had to be evidenced. And if someone gets killed accidentally, family's still going to be mad, right? Family still might get hot, and the crazy uncle is going to come after whoever it was that caused the accident. And so God has provided for cities of refuge. Now, I know in your head you're thinking, well, what kind of thing might God have envisioned to be provided for as an unintentional kind of death? Well, I'm glad you asked. Read the next verse. Verse 5. As when someone goes into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, and the head slips from the handle and strikes his neighbor so that he dies, he may flee to one of those cities and live. Now, I just got to be honest with you. In my weird, sanctified imagination, when I sit and study a passage like this, I often think, why is that the example that the Lord gives in inspired scripture? That, there's an infinite number of ways that someone could accidentally die, and he gives to Moses when an axe head comes loose from its handle and kills somebody. We aren't really told why. This is just an example that's given us in verse 5. They could go to these cities of refuge. Verse 6, lest the avenger of blood and hot anger pursue the manslayer and overtake him, because the way is long, and strike him fatally, though the man did not deserve to die, since he had not hated his neighbor in the past. I was reading that today, and I just circled that phrase, deserve to die, and I just was pondering that. Like, we all deserve to die because of our sin, right? There's the sense in which theologically we can say, we all deserve to die. But God's clearly making a point here that under his law, this person doesn't deserve to die. Yes, as a sinner, God would be right and just to wipe us all out. But he provides for this person to have security. Look at the next paragraph. We're going to skip over those next few verses. They're all about cities of refuge, manslaying. But in verse 11, he reverts back and says, but if anyone hates his neighbor and lies in wait for him and attacks him and strikes him fatally so that he dies, and he flees into one of these cities, then the elders of his city shall send and take him from there and hand him over to the avenger of blood so that he may die. Your eye shall not pity him, but you shall purge the guilt of innocent blood from Israel, so that it may be well with you. So don't try to sneak into a city of refuge quietly and secretly if you've committed murder. The law provided for them to turn you out so that you could face the punishment that you deserved. Now, those verses that I skipped over, verses 8 through 10, it's an interesting little section that I should comment on just quickly. God says, hey, if you're obedient and I enlarge your territory, then I'm going to allow for you to have more cities of refuge. It only makes sense. As we're thinking about the people entering the land, living underneath God's law, one of the things that comes up over and over and over again is that this is the land that God is giving. This is the land that God is providing in his faithfulness. This is the place that the Lord has chosen. His holy city, his holy temple, which will be built. We have a hard time, I think, in our day understanding the geospatial reality of what God was giving Old Testament Israel. You cannot defile the land. The law prescribed clean and unclean, murder and manslaughter in cities of refuge. And over again, we're reading in the law, you cannot defile the land. This is the land that I've given you. We've defined this essence of kingdom. It doesn't come from me, but God's people living in God's place, underneath God's rule or God's law, experiencing God's blessing. This is what the Garden of Eden was supposed to be. This is what the people are supposed to be doing as they build tabernacle and as they build temple. But ultimately, all of the land is given by God. Provision's going to be made when we get to the section on warfare, that when they come into the land, they're to kill everybody, but the fruit trees and all of those other things that have been planted by people that weren't them, they keep all of that stuff. Now, it can't be planted near one of their altars, unless it be an idol. Remember that from a few weeks ago? But God wanted them to be provided for from the fruit of the land, because he had told them, this is the land that I'm giving you that's flowing with milk and honey. It's fertile. I'm going to provide all your needs. It's like a return to the Edenic state. But you have to live underneath my law. Those verses that I skipped over are never realized in the Old Testament, because their territory is never enlarged, because they disobey and they're unfaithful. This promise that God had given is never actually seen to unfold in that way. Look in verse 14. You shall not move your labors and landmark, which the men of old have set in the inheritance that you will hold in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. My dad owns about 40 acres of land in northeast Arkansas where we would hunt when we were growing up. My aunt owned 120 acres that adjoined that 40 acres. And then there was a crazy guy that owned the next piece of property over from it. And I remember as a little kid, my dad would walk me to the boundary markers. And he had hunted there and roamed the land enough that he knew right where they were. And I never knew where I was at in the land. He would say, well, the creek's going to turn, and then the white oak tree is going to be over there, and then there's going to be a metal stake in the ground, and that's my corner. And he could visualize it. He could see it. He had done all the topographical maps of it. I was just a kid that wanted to kill a deer, and I didn't understand the boundaries. I didn't understand the landmarks. Why was this important for them to not move their neighbor's landmark? What is it tantamount to? It's stealing, right? It's being a thief. It's not just, hey, I'd like to plant something here. I'm just going to move this a little bit. The idea here is nobody's paying attention. I'm moving the boundary lines for my family, for my tribe, for my clan, for the generations that follow. And the Lord made very clear, no, this is stealing. It's all underneath still. We're not yet to that section of Deuteronomy that's going to talk about stealing. This is still all under the commandments about murdering. But then we pick up verse 15. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who were in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. It shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. What's this passage about? Okay, this passage is about truth, false testimony, bearing false witness. Give me a rundown of what the law says needs to happen if there's a question mark. Okay, so first of all, there has to be evidence and witnesses. Then what? Okay, then they go before some people. What do? Okay, find out who's lying. That's a good way to put it, Miss Judy. They get to the bottom of it, right? Somebody else in the back say something? There's 2 key things that I think we miss, and you didn't intentionally miss them, but you missed them when you gave me those answers. Number 1, those people are to be brought not just before the priests and the judges, but before who? The first person that's mentioned is they're to be brought before the Lord. So the idea here is they're brought to the spiritual place among the spiritual people. The Lord is there. And then the priests and judges are supposed to figure it out. And how do they figure it out? The English translation of the Hebrew says they inquire diligently. Here's what we would say. They ask lots of questions. Look, when you're trying to determine, even in the context of relationships today, what's happened? What's going on? Whether it's in church, whether it's in family, whatever the case may be, the law here and all throughout the Old Testament, especially in books like Proverbs, give us wisdom. And part of that wisdom is there's wisdom in the counsel of many. There should be a plurality of people involved. Someone can't just come in and say, well, you just have to believe me. No, there has to be evidence. There has to be witnesses. The Lord is involved in this process. And ultimately, it is only right for lots of investigation to happen, to ferret out what exactly is the truth. What exactly is the motivation? What exactly happened? What exactly is the heart? And to get to the bottom of it. And the Lord is gracious in giving us this. Twice in these verses in chapter 19, God says, whether it's with a murderer or whether it's somebody that's been lying and they've been proven to bear false witness, God says, don't pity them. Your eye should not have pity for them. So I think there's a difference, especially in our day, between wanting to show grace and forgiveness and wanting to see reconciliation and restoration, but not pitying someone who's done something so heinous and so wrong against the Lord and against his character. Now look in chapter 20 with me, just very quickly. Verses 1 through 9 are warnings against war. Warnings about war. So here's what you should do. We're not going to read this passage tonight. I'll pick up with this next week. But I want to prepare you for next week. Here's what you should do when you're going to go to war. You should ask questions. Questions like, hey, is anybody afraid to go to war? Go back. We don't want you fighting with us if you're afraid. And ultimately, what the law is going to state is, it's not just that this is like a psychological problem for our army, but this is ultimately disobedience to the Lord, because the Lord is commanding you not to fear. So if there are those who are fearful amongst the forces, have them go back. If there's business they need to deal with, have them go back. But in this section is set up, there are going to be cities that are far away, and you're to actually offer them peace. They're going to be outside of the land that I'm giving to you, and so offer them peace. What are they to do to the people that are inside the boundary of the land that God has given them? They are to wipe them out completely. We've talked about this a lot over the last 4 years as we've walked through the Old Testament, and giving an argument for theodicy, that it is right and righteous and just for God's wrath to come against these people in this way. I want you to think and pray and chew on that even more ahead of next week. And I want you to do so by thinking about this biblical framework. Okay? Here's a structural understanding of God's wrath and judgment and warfare as it unfolds in the pages of the New Testament. First, there's the book of Genesis. And people come against God's people in Genesis. Okay? So whether it is Jacob and Esau is sent off, and the descendants of Esau who become the Edomites are ultimately going to be people that are going to go against God's people. From the very beginning in the book of Genesis, there are people who are waging war underneath the rule and reign of the enemy to go against God and his anointed. This is Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain against the Lord and against his anointed? And all the way back in Genesis, we're told the measure of God's wrath will one day be full against the Amorites and the Edomites and all the other ites. God is going to bring judgment, and he's going to exact his vengeance on them one day. We forget about that, though. And so when we come to the book of Joshua and they start killing folks, it upsets us. It doesn't seem right when we come to Deuteronomy 18 and 19 and 20, and now we've got God saying, when you go into the land that I give you, wipe them all out. Imagine it this way. This is a terrible illustration, but imagine it as if the glass is being filled up, generation after generation after generation after generation, warning after warning after warning, warring against God's people, wreaking havoc, debauchery, idolatry, sexual immorality. God's wrath is filling to overflowing. And now we're at the point where God is giving his divine decree to do exactly what he said he was going to do all the way back in Genesis. And so in Deuteronomy 20, he says, all the ites that still live in the land, take them out. What happens in the book of Joshua? Do they take them out? They do not take them out to the extent that God had told them to. They were disobedient. What was the result? The book of Judges, where everyone did what was right in his own eyes and there was no king in Israel. Judges follows Joshua and is in essence a sad tale of what happens when you disobey the Lord. He had told them what to do. They didn't do it. And so all these people still live in the land, and it creates chaos for God's people. And guess what? All those people still live in the land when a guy named Ezra comes back to rebuild the temple. All those people still live in the land when Nehemiah comes back and says, we've got to rebuild the walls because these people are crazy. And they're going to come against the Lord and against his anointed. And Ezra and Nehemiah, starting this Sunday, we're going to see, hey, guess what? You Israelite people have intermarried with all of them. And God's going to now bring judgment against you because of what you've done. And so all of the prophetic works are telling them, you shouldn't have done that. Come out and be holy. You shouldn't have intermarried. Live like God told you to live underneath the law. And God's ultimately going to take his hand off of national Israel. He's going to bring about the Lord Jesus. He's going to establish a new covenant church. And then he's going to tell his people, okay, now you, in a different way, you, the church, you come out. You come out from among the world. And you be for me a peculiar people. No longer will you pick up the sword, but you'll live as my people underneath my rule, underneath my word, underneath my reign. And I will provide for you through the blood of my son, the promised one. I will provide for you the ultimate and eternal place of refuge that you don't deserve, but that I give you because of my grace. All of what we're seeing on Sunday mornings and on Wednesday nights is unfolding, and it's all connected. And as we talk about this war that's about to be unleashed, it's really important that we be able to see the big story and understand what God's doing there. Okay? We'll see you next week. If you can please stay and help us with tables and chairs, that would be fantastic.